Welcome to this episode of Brains Trust. This special episode is about a very special ship, and the ship was India's first aircraft carrier, INS Vikrant. The INS Vikrant was acquired from the UK, where she was called HMS Hercules. To tell you the story of the INS Vikrant and the early days of the aircraft carrier in the Indian Navy, we have an officer who was amongst the first 12 officers to be commissioned to fly off the INS Vikrant, Rear Admiral Santosh Gupta, who in the 1971 received a Maha Vir Chakra flying off the INS Vikrant. So it's a great privilege and honor to have you on Brains Trust, and we thank you for having taken the time to be with us. And you're the only one who can tell us the story about what was the background when INS Vikrant was acquired, what were the circumstances, and how did it happen in 1950s and early 1960s in such a small navy which was kind of growing at the time. It was taking baby steps.
That when Lord Mountbatten was Viceroy and then became the Governor General, he was a naval officer, a true professional, and he visited the NDA and reviewed our parade. And this was in about the second half of 1956. And then we were called for volunteers within the next 8 months. So it was obvious that the Navy was going to acquire its first aircraft carrier. Vikrant at that time was known as Hercules, HMS Hercules. Her keel was laid in 1942, and like her, there were a number of other aircraft carriers who also keels were laid in 1942. But because the war ended in 1945, they were cocooned and kept away till they could afford to sell these to friendly countries. And that's how it really happened. We acquired INS Vikrant, changed the name to Vikrant, and likewise Canada got one and Australia got another. So that is the story.
So you graduated from the National Defence Academy after having finished your schooling from Doon School. But how did you choose naval aviation, the flying branch of the Indian Navy? It was such a small part of the entire operation of a young service.
I joined flying at a later date after serving as a 3-year cadet, 3 years training in NDA. And whilst we were still cadets on the ship, we were asked to volunteer for flying. And we were told that Mountbatten had just come and gone. And in fact, he inspected our parade in late 56. And thereafter, we knew this is the outcome of his visit, in which he's probably sold us the aircraft carrier. The important thing was that we were all seasick. It was the monsoon period, and we all put up our hands, volunteers, all 29 of us volunteered. Then there were some colorblind and there were others who had to back out. Finally, we were told to get permission from your parents, one's parents first, and then only they would go ahead and give our names in. In this process, 6 of us got permission from home, and that's how we became naval flying cadets or naval aviation cadets.
So tell me, how was the training like for young aviators like you when you joined the flying branch in the 1950s?
And very soon thereafter, after 6 more months in a training ship as a midshipman, we were told to go and join the Air Force Academy in Jodhpur. This was in May 1957. So we were the first lot in the sense that after the acquisition of the aircraft carrier, which is still in the making, it's still in the modification mode in Belfast, in the UK, that we started flying from Jodhpur, 1 year in Jodhpur with the normal piston engines and so on, and then 1 year in Hakimpet, Hyderabad with the jet flying. Thereafter, the 2 years were over, we were back in the Navy and now flying Vampires, same that we had flown with the Air Force, as also converted to sea land aircraft, which are amphibious aircraft could land in the sea.
So flying off the ground is very different from flying off the deck of an aircraft carrier. And you are amongst the chosen few who converted to flying off the aircraft carrier. Tell us about that story.
There's quite a good change, if I may say this, but we are now waiting for further orders to take us to UK. And sure enough, it happened in June or July 1960, when we, in batches, went and joined the commanding officer designate, the senior pilot designate, and the air warfare instructor designate. The first lot of 3 had actually gone sometime in the end December 59, and in between my going in July 1960, there were 2 batches of 2 and 3. So I was, by that time, I think I must have been the 7th, 8th in the squadron, but more were to join after me. And in the end, we were 12 of us. I was the junior most pilot when I joined the squadron in the UK, and the ship, when embarked the squadrons, I was then the junior most in the squadron, or the fighter squadron, doing the workup with the assistance of the Royal Navy or Fleet Air Arm, and flying, very intensive flying for about 13 months in South Wales, very notorious for its bad weather, but there was a good training ground. That's how I got into the aviation branch, and after that there was no looking back.
So I read somewhere that there were some modifications carried out to the HMS Hercules before she converted to INS Vikrant. What were those modifications?
The Vikrant was modified to suit jet aircraft. Also, it modified to have an angle deck, so that in case the pilot missed a wire, he would go around again without going into the other aircraft. Third modification was to assist the pilot for landing on the correct glide path. There was a mirror, gyro-stabilized mirror on the left side, which the pilot had to watch and keep that ball, we call it meatball, in the center of the mirror. And so long as you're doing that and following the center line of the ship, that is all that is required. The speed being correct, the attitude being correct, we hooked on every time.
So while you were training on aircrafts which would be flown off the Vikrant, what was happening to the ship, to INS Vikrant? Tell us about its commissioning.
Because after that 1 year or 1 year, 1 month, Vikrant was ready to take us on board. This was in 1960, July. And so we did a deck conversion with Vikrant in the English Channel. And then Vikrant went back and did a rectification of small defects, whilst we were winding up from Royal Naval Air Station Brawdy. And then the next thing was, when the ship sailed out finally, left the English ports, we flew on as a squadron with 12 aircraft and 10 pilots. Thereafter, we sailed to the Mediterranean, where the second squadron joined us, but not immediately. They were working from Hier near Toulon in France. We also disembarked, we did night flying there with them. And thereafter, when the ship was ready again, and so were the squadrons, we flew back on board. And thereafter, a very, very intensive workup started of trying to get us operational within the span of 2 months. With the guidance of the Royal Air Force, very experienced aircrew and very senior aircrew, very admired by the Royal Navy, who were on loan to us for 2-3 months, just 3 of them. They made sure that we got used to the kind of flying that they were suggesting. After a very intensive month and a half in Malta, off Malta, we did a lot of night flying, we did a lot of air-to-air firing, we did air-to-ground firing. Finally, the squadron got assessed for its operational grading. And sure enough, we came out with flying colours. Thereafter is a question of going back home to India. The ship sailed through the Suez Canal. Before we did that, our Prime Minister, we knew, was very friendly with the President of Egypt. So we paid a visit to Alexandria and then on to Cairo with General Nasser there. And we were looked after like VVIPs. And the ship then sailed at the end of this through the Suez Canal arriving in Bombay on the 3rd of November 1961. That is short was the Vikrant's commissioning.
So what were the aircrafts which were on board the Vikrant when it was commissioned, and what are the aircrafts you flew at that time?
The Vikrant, since its commissioning, had the Seahawk aircraft. They also called the White Tigers. The other squadron was the Cobra squadron of Élysée, French manufactured Élysée aircraft. And then there were 3 helicopters for search and rescue and communications on board. And these continued throughout till about mid-1970s. I was fortunate enough to have flown both types of aircraft by day and night on the carrier. But it's more luck, really. I was meant for the Tiger Squadron, and which I had commissioned. But there was, at that time, a dearth of pilots in the other squadron, and they wanted an air warfare instructor who was proficient in air weaponry. So I was transferred there for a year and a bit, but actually served with them for just 1 year. And then I was absorbed back into the fighter stream.
Sir, did the Vikrant see action from the time it was commissioned till 1971?
Although Vikrant had participated in the Goa liberation in 1961, December, our role was proactive, but only in ensuring that no foreign interference could take place in support of Portuguese. But after that, there was nothing happened. The Chinese War of 62, we had no part to play. But in 65, there were 2 wars. Early part of 65, the first half was, Vikrant was operational. I was serving on Vikrant. A lot of intensive flying was carried out. But the hostilities petered off, and it was revived again in September of the same year. In that year, however, by that time, Vikrant had been taken into dock for emergency repairs, and that she was not available anymore until the end of 65. So Vikrant really drew no blood. It stayed put in the dry docks, with the squadron also disembarked in Goa with no role to play.
So there is a little known story about the Vikrant and your marriage. Would you be willing to share it? It's a very interesting story, only if you are willing to share it.
In the early part, in May 65, my marriage had been fixed for 12th of May, and accordingly, Vikrant gave me leave to go and get married. And so on the 4th, I took the train and went via Bangalore on my way from Cochin to Dehradun. But by the time I got to Bangalore, the military police told me that I have to go back to Cochin as hostilities had been declared between India and Pakistan. Now, so I went back accordingly on the 5th to the 12th when I got married. The squadron and I were all on Vikrant at sea, exercising, preparing for the war with the fleet. Apparently, the admiral of our fleet admiral was made aware that I was to get married on the 12th of May. So he agreed with the commanding officer Vikrant to give me an aeroplane to get married and come back within 24 hours. And that's what happened. On 12th May, I took off and went from Vikrant, which was operating about 100 miles off Goa, to Bangalore, which is about 400 miles away. Landed there, got married, and next morning I was back on Vikrant with the same aircraft, again about 100, 200 miles away from Goa.
So how did your in-laws get to know that you are arriving in Bangalore to get married?
Since my going to Bangalore was uncertain, and my father-in-law to-be agreed that if I don't make it on the 12th May, then they would understand that the wedding would be postponed. But they did not give up. Now, just to make sure that they knew that I was coming, on arrival at Bangalore and before landing, I went low over the house and flew 1 or 2 circles around the house to tell them that I've come. And by the time I got to HAL airport and landed and refueled the aircraft and looked and put it in the hangar, the reception party was already waiting for me at the airport.
So what you did is really interesting, and you had taken permissions, but would it have got you into serious trouble?
The thing is that there's no proof that I had taken off. It was not an authorized sortie. Nowhere was it mentioned that I was going to Bangalore and coming back. And so, nor was our marriage registered. So I keep teasing my wife that we're really not married because we had no registration and there's no proof that I was there in Bangalore.
So when you did assume command of the Seahawks, the 300 Squadron, otherwise known as the White Tiger Squadron, what was it like leading up to 1971, since the Vikrant did not see action in 1965?
I took over the White Tiger Squadron in January 1970. And whilst we were embarked on the ship developed a defect, a very major defect by July 1970, which necessitated her going back to Bombay for repairs, and consequently the squadrons were disembarked en route, and my squadron then came back to Goa, where we were based as a family station. Now, at that stage, we all thought we'll never get back on Vikrant again for two reasons. One was the Vikrant's boiler, which was defective, could not be replaced in a hurry. The manufacturers would take 3 to 4 years to give us a new one and install it and carry out trials. By that time, the Seahawks that we were flying were also getting very old. Their manufacture had stopped 10 years before, and those spares were coming. So less and less flying was being carried out. So in that state where the Vikrant was non-operational, and the squadron itself, the fighter squadron, was again non-operational, we never thought we would ever have to go to war, forget about embarking the Vikrant at all.
Sir, thank you very much for being on this episode. For all of you who are watching this episode, you would have gathered that the Vikrant did not participate in the 1965 war, since it was decided that the Navy will not operate above what is called the Porbandar parallel. If you see the map, it would be obvious to you that they were contained below the Porbandar parallel. In 1971, the Navy played a decisive role in the battle, and that was the Navy's finest hour. And the centerpiece of that battle was Indian naval ship Vikrant. You must watch that episode narrated by Rear Admiral S K Gupta, who got a Maha Vir Chakra for the 1971 operations.